Those of you signing in, we're going to get started in just a minute or two. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the State Historic Preservation Office, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 40th Annual Preserve Minnesota Conference and our second of 6 sessions. I hope everyone is doing well. I am Amy Spong, Director with the State Historic Preservation Office, and I'm speaking to you from my home in St. Paul, Minnesota, the homeland of the Dakota people. I invite you all to let us know where you are participating from and welcome you to Acknowledged Tribal Communities. Minnesota is also within the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe. You can do that by typing in the chat feature and clicking on the icon that looks like a circle on the bottom of the screen, and then enter in your comment. There are at least 13,000 years of American Indian history in Minnesota. Other Native nations with ancestral connections here include the Iowa, Ho-Chunk, Cheyenne, Cree, Lakota, and Assiniboine. We'd also love to hear if this is your first time joining a Preserve Minnesota conference, so feel free to type that into the chat feature if you are a first-time attendee, and welcome. If you were with us last year in St. Cloud, you may have filled out an online survey regarding the updating of Minnesota's preservation plan or voted for a preservation mascot. For this year's conference, we were going to conclude a year of engagement and forward the draft plan to the National Park Service for final approval. However, our timeline has been modified and we have received a year-long extension. There are still ways to engage with this process, and a draft plan will be for public comment now in mid-2021. You can sign up for SHPO's Gov delivery messaging by visiting our webpage to subscribe. We've all been adjusting to the global pandemic, and our virtual conference reflects those adjustments. While the SHPO team values the networking opportunities we have during our in-person events, we hope that our online series will allow for greater access and participation for the sessions scheduled over the next 3 weeks. Thank you for being a part of this virtual conference and joining us from your home or wherever you are tuning in. Computer screens with virtual presentations are no substitute for meeting face-to-face. So we appreciate you taking the time to join us. With that, I want to welcome our speakers for this morning's session on collaborative planning for Indian Mounds. Brenda Williams is a historical landscape architect with Quinn Evans. Cheyenne St. John is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer of the Lower Sioux Indian Community. And we have Bianca Paz, Project Manager, and Alice Messer, Division Manager with the City of St. Paul Parks and Recreation Department. Welcome.
Thank you, Amy. This is Brenda here, Brenda Williams, and I am in Madison, Wisconsin, the home of the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin. And I'm going to get us started off here. Just let me get my video shared. Just a second. There we go. All right. So the Indigenous burial ground that is currently called the Indian Mounds Regional Park has been a sacred site and a place of burial for over 1,000 years. It is significant to living Indigenous people as a cemetery where their ancestors are buried. The area is sacred to the Upper Sioux community, the Lower Sioux Indian community, the Shakopee Metawakan Sioux community, the Prairie Island Indian community, the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate. Their cultural traditions place responsibility on them for caring for this sacred ground. Although they were forcibly removed from their homeland, they have continued to come here to pray and connect with their ancestors. It is a place of reverence, remembrance, respect, and prayer. So during this presentation, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to Indian Mounds as a place and the cultural landscape study that we undertook focused on this place. And then Cheyenne and Bianca are going to discuss some suggestions for working with tribes on planning and design projects, as well as challenges and successes of the project and ways that they can inform other projects. We're also going to share resources to support building relationships with tribes. So why are we talking about this today? Consultation with tribes is understood well by agencies that undertake a government-to-government process that is regulated, especially through federal agencies. But many cultural landscapes are significant to tribes that do not trigger, the projects don't trigger consultation by law, but it is still necessary and very important to work with tribes to understand their concerns and their perspectives related to these sites. There are many agencies and municipalities who are not sure about how to include tribes in planning, design, and maintenance decisions for those types of sites. And we did a pre-conference survey. It really confirmed this. We were hoping to, from this survey, maybe get some tips and hints and suggestions. And we didn't get a whole lot of that. We got a few. But what we did get is an understanding that what you're seeing on the left here is 55 non-tribal organizations or agencies representatives responded, and of those, about half of them have working relationships with tribes. The other half do not, or are not sure if they do or not. On the right, what you see is a list of organizations, or what we're calling resources, organizations who are out there ready to help people understand how to work with tribes. And you can see that the respondents are knowledgeable of, for instance, the State Historic Preservation Office and MIAC, the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, but much fewer people are aware of some of the organizations that really provide direct connections and teaching and education about tribal perspectives, like the Minnesota Humanities Center and Healing Place Collaborative. So that was interesting to us, and we may do a post-session survey in which we would follow up and ask you to share ideas that you have. So just like we're doing here, we'd love to have more ideas to share and to collect and distribute among the participants. So, all right, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the place now. The cemetery is located on a high bluff at a steep bend in the Mississippi River. It is a very sacred site. The mounds are on top of the bluff, and down below at the base of the bluff is a cave and a spring. And these places in the landscape drew Dakota and other indigenous people to this location well before European Americans came. This site, you can see where the green arrow is pointing to the kind of squiggly lines. That is the project area that we're talking about. And then the blue dots are other sites within the area referred to as Bedote by the Dakota. And Bedote is refers to the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. And this is a place of origin for many Dakota tribes. The blue dots are other sacred sites, and you can see that there are quite a few here in this area. So as we zoom into the Indian Mounds site up on this bluff, we're going to just look at a few diagrams that show us a little bit of how this landscape has changed over time. So between 200 BC and AD 1837, which is a very long time, this was a regional center where tribes came together for ceremonies and events to reinforce communal ties and forge alliances. They built mounds on the top of the bluff as burial sites for, as a cemetery for the people who died here, or even people they brought here. European explorers documented a thriving indigenous community in the region, and amateur archaeologists documented at least 50 and up to 200 mounds on this bluff. The work of those archaeologists did cause damage, but it also helps us understand the full extent of the cemetery that was here. In 1837, the United States created a treaty with the Dakota, which resulted in the removal of many Dakota from Minnesota or from the eastern part of Minnesota. And while many were removed, many still remained close. And this is their homeland. And so even those who were removed, many came back. That treaty resulted in opening up the land for Euro-American settlements, and the city of St. Paul surged into a metropolis. In this particular area, you can see that by 1856, plats were laid over top of the cemetery, and there was the beginning of building of streets and buildings in parts of what is the cemetery. In 1892, the city of St. Paul recognized this bluff as an important site and established a park here. The purpose of the park was to protect the historical setting and the views. But when that occurred, the connections of the Dakota and other indigenous people to this sacred site weren't well understood. They weren't considered either, or really highly valued. And so then over a century, the condition, name, and use of the landscape as a park became beloved to the surrounding neighborhood, and many Native people also continued to visit and pray here. So with the establishment of that park, the landscape here was affected. Roads were built, carriage paths, pedestrian paths. The cemetery became a place for recreation. People came here to picnic, and damage was done to this very sacred site. Over time, other elements were added. An air beacon was constructed on top of one of the mounds in 1929. And over time, the roads required grading and retaining walls and other effects to the mounds themselves. Acknowledging that this damage was done is really important, and that these institutional decisions were harmful to the burial ground and the people who love it deeply. And with an understanding of this, we hope to avoid repeating history and causing more harm in the future. In 1996, local tribes, Dakota tribes, advocated for the addition of protective fencing around the bases of the mounds in order to keep people from having parties and doing other inappropriate things on the mounds. And these fences are still there today, and you can see that the ties of these fences are used as places to leave prayer ties and other respectful mementos. So, as a park, a series of master plans have been developed over time to address how this park is managed. So, beginning in 1974 and in 1981, and then in 2011, there was a master plan amendment. And this amendment was developed without a strong relationship with the tribes, and so it did not benefit from guidance that we were able to add into the process as part of the cultural landscape study. Some of the recommendations in this master plan are not appropriate for a cemetery, including playgrounds and other active recreation and a splash pad. So around 2016, the splash pad that was recommended in this master plan was proposed to be constructed. And at that time, Dakota people advocated for not doing that, which would be disrespectful in this landscape, and worked with the city to develop a plan to create a cultural landscape study. And so that's when I came into this process. And the cultural landscape study had really four major focuses. One purpose is identification of an appropriate process for the City of St. Paul Parks and Recreation Department to use for including associated Indigenous communities in decision-making about sites that are significant to them. The second purpose is to document the historic development and use of the landscape and analyze its significance and integrity. The third is to provide recommendations for long-term condition of the landscape informed by guidance from associated tribes. And the fourth is to include recommendations for messaging to help people understand that this is a sacred place of burial. And this diagram represents the process that we kind of refined throughout the project. And the one thing I wanted to point out in this is there's a lot of synthesizing, testing, refining, advising, collaborating. And at each of those points, we may be pointed in a very different direction than we had originally thought we were going. And it's very important in this process, and it did happen during the project, that we listened and that when we were asked to take a pause to let other decisions and information be developed, that we did that, and that we repointed the process through the guidance of the tribal representatives that worked with us. This list is one that we will share with you through the recording, so I'm not going to read through it, but I wanted to point out that this is a list of, I guess, tips or suggestions that we have been using throughout the entire process, and they're things that are, really set the foundation for having a strong collaboration and building a relationship with the tribes. So one of the key points of this cultural landscape study was development of a vision that was created collaboratively with all participants and informed directly by the concept, the Dakota concept of Matakwe Awasin. And that is reflecting that all is interconnected and all is one. So people and land and animals and plant and the sky, they are all part of one. They are all relatives, and and planning for one without consideration of the other is not going to wind up with a result that is appropriate for this sacred site. So we followed that guidance throughout the project. And I'm just going to read off a few of the recommendations so that we can get into the really important part of this session, which is the conversation with Cheyenne and Bianca. But the recommendations we tried to conceptually represent them with this diagram, but they include a really multifaceted package. There's a framework for landscape condition, which includes things like developing strong relationships and partnerships between the tribes and the city that help inform decision making for the future about care of the site, as well as care of places of burial. The recommendations also provide specific sort of physical recommendations for improving resilience and changing plant materials within the landscape. One thing that is an important aspect is the replacement of large areas of mown lawn with native plant communities, and also improving permeability and water flow by replacing some hardscape with native plant communities. The restoration of those native plant communities is directly intertwined with the restoration of cultural connections to the site. And we also developed a framework along with our partners 10 by 10 and Mona Smith, a framework for messaging, which is very multifaceted and includes Dakota language and place names, immediate acknowledgement to help people in the community understand the changes, a threshold of cues, and also reaching into digital media. So within the project, I think there were a lot of things that were successes, but we also, there's room for improvement. And so Cheyenne and Bianca are going to share with you from their perspectives some suggestions for how to move forward with this type of process, as well as some of the challenges faced and some of the successes we had. And so Cheyenne is going to start with a powerful suggestion that that she is going to articulate for us all.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being a part of our presentation today as a participant. One of the things that was really interesting about this process coming into it, our office came into this project during 2016, 2017, was we definitely recognized that the tribe did not have any relationship with the city of St. Paul prior to this. And so in order to really establish some very meaningful first steps in relationship building, we introduced this concept about getting to know your neighbor. And I think this is something that, you know, whether you're agency representative or attending from your local municipality, it's definitely something that you can adopt across the board. And so, you know, taking those first steps to get to know your neighbors as you would, you know, anybody getting to know your neighbors. And so part of that included, you know, establishing points of contact and trying to share this concept that really is very understandable both on a tribal and non-tribal perspective, so that we can really broaden and strengthen the various understandings that we have of one another. And so we also, you know, wanted to note that, you know, aside from just a project process or compliance need, to really start if you have a tribe in your area, to start building those relationships aside from just, project and process. So getting to know your neighbor was that concept that we really walked forward with in trying to develop meaningful relationships with the city of St. Paul. And so what was really interesting is we did recognize that the city was reciprocating some of those, was integrating that into this process through some of their own avenues. And so I'll pass it to Bianca so she can maybe share a little bit of that.
Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, so Alice Messer, our division manager, and I will share some of the takeaways and the challenges and the things that the lesson learned during this process. So the takeaways that we got came from navigating these challenges during the process. And I want to highlight two major challenges. The first one was when we heard from the community, that the splash pad was not appropriate recreation for this location. The city, Parks Department stopped the project, and I want to acknowledge the Parks Department leadership with Parks Director Maiham and Alice Messer as a division manager, but also the team at that time who was, Kathleen Anglo and Ellen Stewart, who also was part of as a project manager of the whole process. They acknowledge, that this is not right, and we got to stop, and we have to take immediate steps. So the challenge was at that time to how we do this right this time, who are those voices that we need to hear from. And so the first steps was to, stop the project and request for an extension of the funding and change the scope of work of the splash pad, but to learn. And the most important was that we needed to stop and listen and learn from the people who care about this place, for the park, but for what it is, which is a burial site. The next step, and that wasn't part of the project, but it was more like a decision the team was to, we need to learn about this. And we took advantage of that opportunity that the Minnesota Humanities Centers provide the Dakota, which is help the participants to experience the history of the Dakota land from the Dakota people, from their stories, and give you a vision of the Dakota land in the Twin Cities and different sacred places. So it's not only about the site, but the whole, river valley and the whole context of where the site is. I think that was very enlightening and helped to understand what next steps needed to be taken. And the other takeaway was getting the right team. Even the request for proposal needed to be guided by the tribes or by the tribe representative. So we asked, what should the team that is going to lead this cultural landscape process, what the characteristics of this team needs to be. And one of that was we heard is it would be good to have ideally a representative of the tribe in this decision-making process, because usually the tribes are consulted but are not part of this conversation on the other side on making the decisions. So we requested ideally that somebody representing the team, the tribes, can be part of the team, the consultant team. So I think, and the selection process too, we have tribes representatives in the selection process, something that at least the Parks Department hasn't done before, invite to select and score the consultant team. So that helped to kind of guide the scope of work and the team, and having a team with we are very grateful that we got Queen Eva Stemachem and allies with Mona Smith as representative from the tribes that has been focused not just on following, the steps of a scope of work, but also to be flexible and changing and focus on the building this relationship, kind of bridge that communication with the tribes and the city, and bring us together, and also provide a robust community engagement process with the community. So the different meetings we had there with the community were also very informative and very help us to build that relationship. Alice, I don't know if you want to add something to that.
Sure. Thank you all. Thanks, Cheyenne and Bianca. The couple things that I want to add is I just am so grateful as a department that we have this chance to not repeat history, that we really are creating this document that's going to reshape how this land is viewed. It is no longer a park, it is a cemetery. And it's just, it's so important that we're having this conversation. I think the team within design and construction, we have learned so much along the way. And I think our next challenge is actually to continue to share this information. The city of St. Paul is huge. And I think about that graphic of interconnectedness, and I feel like it's our role to continue to share this information and how important the landscape is and how to be respectful. Some of the challenges along the way have been, people within the department asking about planting a memorial tree, sort of these day-to-day things that happen in the city, and just making sure that understanding of why we can't penetrate this sacred ground, why this is not appropriate, and just continue to be shepherds of carrying this message forward, and just making sure that the acknowledgement is in the landscape, so people can continue to understand how sacred this site is. I think it's going to be a long process, and it's just the way it is. It's important things take a long time. I think the other challenge we learned is that sometimes the processes of funding, there's these benchmarks of when funds expire. And again, we just have to explain to our partners why this is so important, why we need to take time and explore every avenue for flexibility, because rushing is not going to lead to a good solution.
Thanks so much, Alice. Cheyenne, I would love to hear some of your thoughts. We kind of moved right into the challenges, and I know there's a few challenges that you were hoping to touch on as well.
Sure. Thank you, Alice and Bianca, for explaining that a little further. One of the things from Lower Sioux, or from the tribal perspective, that we definitely recognized was that the process, although it was new and still establishing itself as far as relationship building, it was definitely not without barriers. And so first of which was just having the city acknowledge that there had been no previous consideration for the impacts that would happen on this site, and knowing that this is, for tribes, knowing that this is an Indigenous corridor. It's not just one isolated location that we were looking at having these impacts happen to, but it's an entire corridor. And so being able to work with the city to broaden their understanding on a few of those areas, as well as just the tribal perspective about impacts and thresholds. Tribes don't look at these effects the same way that maybe municipalities and agencies do, or they're not defined the same way as you might read in the regs. Tribes don't have a threshold for pollution and impacts. We don't say that once the river is this polluted, then it's bad. That concept isn't a part of our thinking process when it comes to land and to these sacred areas. And so having to get the agencies or the city of St. Paul in this case to have a better understanding of that was certainly a challenge. And I think that we were able to broaden their understanding through being a part of this outreach process, consultation process. As Bianca had mentioned, they participated in the Badote tour that's offered by the Minnesota Humanities Center. And so I think just being able to connect to those different locations and, heighten their understanding of what the landscape means from a tribal perspective was huge for us, and definitely acknowledging that. Secondly, I would say that, this ecological concept about, pollution impacts and effects is definitely not supported, especially with this Indian Mounds project not being a federal undertaking. That was certainly a challenge from a tribal perspective to find policies and guidelines that could help enforce some of that concept that tribes were coming into this process with. And, whether it's NEPA or it's the 106 consultation that is applicable, the challenge of evaluating impacts is very different from a tribal perspective versus a municipality or an agency perspective. So I would say those are definitely the two biggest challenges that I recognized. So thank you, Brenda.
Thanks so much, Diane. I also there was one more thing that we've talked about a little bit, and it kind of was woven throughout the whole project. This project started as a cultural landscape study and interpretation plan. And when you see it now, it's called a messaging plan. And I think that it took us a long time. We, from our perspective of the design team, we thought of how important it was to interpret and tell stories. And really what we heard and began to slowly understand is that it's not a place to tell stories about. We need to send a message to people. It needs to be acknowledged that it's a cemetery, and then we need to develop messaging, which is happening now, that helps people understand why this is a significant place and why there are changes happening here that need to occur in order to protect that significance. That was a big one on my list too. I would love to pass it back to I think Bianca and Alice to ask about what you feel are some successful outcomes of the project and how this project may have made a difference for the city.
Yeah, before that, I wanted to add to your comment about the need of a messaging at this location. I think that's a challenge that we're still facing because the site is in an urban setting, in an urban area, and we have a neighborhood, right next to it. And the neighborhood takes this ownership of the site, and it has been, perceived as a park for so many years. And it's a place where they, take kids to the play area or for walking. And, it's a neighborhood that had been kind of disrupted from the rest of the context with, the highway, and we have the street, the boulevard going through the park. So this is a place that is going to be hard. We're going to receive a lot of pushback, or we have already, for some of the changes, because it's so important, this messaging, what we need to say, and that messaging is guided by the tribes. So I think what that kind of connects with the success, I think, is to have been able to develop an immediate acknowledgement plan with a team, the same consultant team that helped us to provide this cultural landscape study. Like the next step was to create this immediate acknowledgement strategies to communicate the community that this is not a place for recreation, and yeah, we need to start changing the name of the park to a cemetery, to a burial site. So how we make those strategies, we're still in that working on that with the guidance of the TPOs, and that's going to be the next step. You know, putting that in from messaging out there. But as Brenda said, you mentioned it. This is not. We don't want to turn this into interpretation, museum. It has to be a place for the communication has to be like, this is a place to be respected. This is a burial site. And that's a challenge. And I think, yeah, part of the success is that creating this awareness first in our department, the Parks Department. I think all our staff, the maintenance operations staff have been involved in this process, and we are aware of that we need to follow a protocol or consult the tribes before we make any decision on the site. Pass it to Alice. You want to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Bianca. I think I would say the biggest success with this project is the relationships we've built. I think if we were in this situation when the master plan was done in 2011, it would be an entirely different plan, and we would be in a much different point. So I think the conversations we have had over the past couple of years are invaluable. Quinn Evans has been a great partner on this. One of the things we've talked about is as the consultant agreement kind of ends, how do we make sure that these relationships continue? And that we continue these great conversations. So I know that's something that we've been talking about internally, and hope that we can come to ideas together, Cheyenne, with you and other tribal agencies, just to continue to build on that. Because there is a lot of land along the river that's very important, and it's not always going to follow the federal process. So that really is one of the outcomes that we're looking for. Another success is starting the conversations of how to maintain the site currently known as Indian Mounds, and making sure that we have tribal leadership guiding that, because again, I don't think we necessarily know what to do, and we need some guidance on what's the best way to maintain this site. And it's going to be really important as the plan becomes implemented and the landscape changes. We need to make sure that we have a long-term framework of how we'll maintain it. So I think that is really important. And then the other piece and this just struck me personally, is in the messaging plan, is the idea, instead of, maybe it's me when I think about boundaries and kind of land that is parkland and then residential land, the thing that struck me is the analogy of this is a watercolor, that these sites blend in, and we need to think about not just this line of where the cemetery ends, but thinking about the whole landscape. So some of those graphics and explanations are really helpful for me in the messaging planner, to just continue to illustrate how important this site is.
Diane, do you want to talk about some things that you feel like are that are successful or might be helpful to share with others?
Sure. One of the first successes that I have to acknowledge is that throughout this process, as we're kind of winding down here to these different in these different phases, is that for tribes, we were able to reclaim and maintain the integrity of this sacred burial location. And so I think that was one of the biggest successes from the tribal perspective. The second one is, thinking about the future concerns that tribes may have about this site, and having the reinforcement of knowing that we have a cooperative understanding now with the city of St. Paul. That really reinforces our working relationship, that if there are going to be any, types of activities or changes to the site in the future, that we will be able to have those conversations very meaningfully, because we have this established relationship. We're neighbors, and we know each other. We know who to call if there's concerns. Certainly the city of St. Paul knows, is a lot more familiar now with the tribal outreach process. And so I think, yeah, those would definitely be the two biggest successes.
Thanks so much, Cheyenne. I wanted to, I think John, can people still see my screen? Because one thing I wanted to do is share a list of resources. And again, both this and that list of suggestions and tips will be available to everyone who's in the session viewing it. But I'm just putting this up here so you can look at it. There's quite a few agencies and groups who are great at helping people think about how to connect with tribes and how to work with them. And then if we have any questions, this would be a great time for us to hear what those questions are. John, if you want to share those. And if not, we actually have a few questions to ask our audience as well.
Sure, Brenda, thanks. We actually don't have any questions in yet, but folks are free to use the Q&A box, chat box, and as soon as I said that, one comes in.
John, it's very hard to hear you.
Sure, yeah, we do have a question in the Q&A box. How have you tried to balance the message of the location with the possibility of that message perhaps enticing looters who might want to try to dig up sacred funerary items?
That is a great question. Cheyenne, would you like to say a few words about that before I go into the recommendation?
Just some of the immediate things that come to mind in response to that question is, the messaging is it's very noticeable when there will be Dakota language that, helps folks understand more of this concept behind Watakuye Owasin, and hopefully getting folks to understand more through this messaging and these different identifiers on the landscape, like signage or benches, that this is a really important space. And in addition to that, I know that when the mounds were fenced in, there was also some signage there that was placed, kind of identifying that these are not to be disturbed. There's, activities not to take place there. Brenda, feel free to add on to that.
Yeah, I think one of the things, and this has been very carefully guided by the tribal historic preservation officers. And so our partner 10 by 10 and Mona Smith have been developing, especially right now, what we're calling the immediate acknowledgement. And it has been careful. It's not like signs that are saying there's a mound here, it's much more like these concepts of that this is a sacred site, and that like the relationship of the sky and the ground is a concept that's being presented in a way that hopefully helps people begin to grasp the holistic sacredness of this place, rather than looking for a particular spot where you might be able to dig something up. The mounds have been visible for a very long time. And in this location, and I think, Cheyenne, you can let me know, but in other locations as well, I think oftentimes when we are not telling the story and we are not helping people understand that this is a cemetery and it's sacred, that actually there's more threats by not acknowledging that. So, you know, and then there's also some other things that are happening, like the addition of native plant materials in the landscape will hopefully make it less apparent or easy for people to come into different locations and be doing things that might be inappropriate. Amy, did you want to have a few words? I just saw you pop up there.
Well, I just, it was maybe a little difficult to hear John. I was just looking, there's been a couple more questions that are popping up, and I'm having trouble reading them on my really small screen. I know, just going from memory a little bit, there was a question about the any plans for restoring some of the native plantings on the mounds.
Okay, I'm sorry. So the question was if there is going to be native planting restored on the mound? Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. So so actually that has already happened on a couple of the mounds, and the recommendations in the report are to expand that program and also to maintain the native plants in a way that is guided by the TIPOs as well as MIAC and the Office of the State Archaeologist to make sure that the plants reestablished are helping to protect rather than to harm the mounds themselves.
And then another question was, how has the master plan changed since the dialogue with the tribe has changed the view of the appropriate uses of the park?
Bianca, would you like to address that one?
I'm gonna have Alice address that.
Okay, sure.
I think the cultural landscape plan or the messaging plan shows a short-term immediate acknowledgement, kind of midterm, and then long-term acknowledgement. I think a lot of the changes are taking, you know, as recreational amenities start to fail, like the playground, it's not going to be replaced there. And finding other places in the neighborhood that are really appropriate for recreational use. There are some similarities, but it's just it's hard to compare them because this is a very intentional messaging plan for the park that balances just having people move through the site and also be, you know, we have to like pull people away from the bluff. Like there's some like safety pieces that we need to have integrated into it, but really I think it's a phased approach to what our long-term vision is for the park.
And I'll just say a couple more words about that.
Yeah.
And that, and if anybody else wants to jump in, please do. But you know, again, that phased approach has been so carefully thought through with the guidance from the TIPOs and from we didn't even really talk about our project advisory team very much at all, but they're an important part of this process, and they have representatives from the residential neighborhood adjacent as well. And so the ideas here are there needs to be this acknowledgement immediately. So that's happening. This is a cemetery. This isn't a park. There are things that are in place that won't look different immediately, but there are also some things that will look different very soon. And so the gradual change is prioritized by first places that really have to be cared for in a different way, because right now the way that they're being treated is either damaging or not respectful, and so that comes first, and then that is gradually expanded to create a broader context within the landscape for the experience that people have as they approach the sacred. One of the things we talked about a lot in the project is that you're not entering a sacred site here. As Cheyenne was saying, this is part of a network of sacred sites, and so part of that messaging is helping people understand that there's like this gradual sort of threshold of understanding and experience that we hope people will begin to absorb as they get these messages and approach the site, and as that evolves over time.
Thank you. And we have a couple more questions here. I'm just going to keep working through. The next one is, suspected mounds and burial site in our area are not confirmed or protected. What is the first step to have these investigated? There is old documentation to support that these exist.
I think, Amy, you might address that one, or we could have Cheyenne address it.
I would have Cheyenne go first.
I just said I was on mute. Sorry about that. I said, Amy, take it away.
Well, as far as burial mounds go, those are handled when there are projects that do that have ground disturbance in them. Those are required in state law to be reported to the Office of the State Archaeologist. And so the state archaeologist receives those reports if there are, findings of any bones of any kind, really, for them to investigate. And they are forwarded then to the MIAC staff and handled that way. I don't know if that's I think this question has more to do about being more proactive about investigations, as opposed to what if something is found during a ground disturbance.
So I will say, on the screen, the two top websites we have here are MIAC and OSA, and so I think it's a great idea to connect with them, and I also think that the concept of wanting to try to protect a site without doing anything invasive is very important. And Cheyenne, you might have some thoughts and ideas about where people could get some guidance in thinking about how to do that.
Certainly, I think a lot of our offices get a lot, reports of informal investigations happening across our counties, and the first step, obviously, is if there is something identified, is to contact the Office of State Archaeology. If it has any Native association, then the Minnesota Indian Affairs gets involved, and they follow a process of contacting the tribes. However, circling back around, if we, oftentimes we do get, farmers or different landowners that come in to share with us that, different resources or, types of material have been found or are being found on their home sites. And so, often if that happens in our county here, my first step is to always loop in OSA if I'm going to do any type of, site visits, just following that same process, that if something was found, that all of the proper authorities are notified. And of course, if they are remains, there's a very clear and concise process for that, to contacting your local police department, letting them know, and continuing on with OSA and so on and so on. So yes, I believe TIPO offices can lend their assistance and their expertise in some of those situations where it might be a private landowner, but elsewhere, just follow that process.
Thank you. And all of a sudden we have a lot of questions coming up, which we may not be able to get to all of them. One of a short question is it inappropriate, disrespectful to walk on the mounds? The head's shaking, yes.
I think now at the Indian Mounds in the mid 90s, they put the fences up because that type of activity was happening. So I think it's really important to ask these questions. We certainly don't want anybody to feel that their questions are inadequate in any sense. It's better to have this information than to not. So.
Great. Are there any concrete plans in place for signage, barriers, walkways, or other changes to the park that are currently underway that are able to be shared publicly? As a cultural resource manager professional and an Anishinaabe person, I am curious as to how the flow chart on the previous slide was used to arrive at those decisions. Sorry, it was in two different sections there.
Yeah, I can respond to that. Yes, we are working, we are calling the immediate acknowledgement messaging plan that is being prepared by Queen Evans, Denby Chen, and allies. That's the first step. We're going to have some signage and some messaging in the landscape that will be implemented hopefully this fall. And we are working also to have some stories being told by the tribes that could be linked to the signs at the site, so people can, connect with these QR codes and in their phones and listen from the story of the site, the history of the site, told by the tribes over by the Dakota people. So those are the first implementation messaging strategies we're going to see soon. But also want to clarify that we heard from the tribe, the guidance was not to disrupt the site. So we're being very careful in what we add. And most of the signs are going to be added to the existing structure. So we're not going to put footings or try to disrupt the site and try to make it very subtle and something that inspires respect when you are entering this location.
And is that particular phase, Bianca, going to be published on the City of St. Paul's website?
We have those graphics. We don't have it currently. I think we can, if after the TIPO's approvals, I think we are gonna be able to publish maybe this week. That can be made public. And the report, the cultural landscape report, is on the city website. If you Google Indian Mounds cultural landscape study and messaging plan or interpretation plan, you will get to that link. And there's a link to the report.
Great, thank you. I'm just looking at the time here, and we are a little bit over from our stop time. So I'm going to go ahead and just thank everyone, thank the presenters for joining us today. I also want to thank John Disher of the SHPO office for handling all the WebEx technical communications piece. We're still kind of working it all out and figuring things out. And then Michael Koop also as our CLG coordinator for all of his work in planning this switching from an in-person to a virtual Conference. Mike, did you have any last words, or I'm putting him on the spot?
No, I think in the interest of time, I'll say no.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us, and we'll hope you all can join us too for next week's sessions. We have 2 more weeks of sessions, and there's still time to register for those as well. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.